Kandahar province, southern Afghanistan, the winter of 2011. A prisoner sits on a metal chair inside a plywood interrogation hut, wrists zip-tied, eyes red from 3 nights without real sleep. He has survived Soviet helicopter gunships as a boy. He has survived his own government's police. He has planted roadside bombs and walked away from firefights that killed men on both sides of him. Fear for him is supposed to be a finished subject. And yet, when the translator asks him what frightens him most about this war, he does not say airstrikes. He does not say drones. He says something stranger. He says that the bombs at least you can hear coming. The men who come at night, he says, you never hear at all. One moment your cousin is asleep beside you. The next, there are hands over his mouth, a red dot on your own chest, and 4 men standing in a room you would have sworn had no door. This is not a story about invincible supermen. It is a story about a small, secretive, chronically underfunded American unit that spent 2 decades operating in the exact shadow that popular culture has always ignored. The shadow between the headline battles and the medal ceremonies, the shadow where wars are actually decided. Hollywood remembers Normandy. It remembers the beaches, the tanks, the generals with their names on textbooks. It has almost nothing to say about a 9-man team fast roping onto a mountain at 10,000 feet in the middle of a snowstorm, or about a compound raid conducted so quietly that the target's own bodyguards did not realize the building had been cleared until the helicopters were already gone. And yet, it is precisely in that ignored shadow that some of the men who hated America most, the fighters of the Taliban and the remnants of Al-Qaeda who fought this country across 2 decades of mountains and desert, left behind the most unwilling tribute imaginable. Not a tribute of surrender, a tribute of dread. To understand why an enemy that showed no fear of bombers and battalions would speak, in captured letters and interrogation transcripts and after-action reports, of the Americans in almost supernatural terms, we have to go back to where this unit was built, and to the handful of nights when it stopped being a rumor and became, for a generation of fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, something closer to a ghost story that happened to be true. The unit did not begin as a myth. It began as a humiliation. In the middle 1970s, an army officer named Charles Beckwith, a blunt, profane veteran who had trained alongside British special forces in the jungles of Malaya, came home convinced that the United States had no answer for the new age of hostage takings and hijackings then spreading across the world. He proposed a unit built not around size or firepower, but around selection so brutal that most qualified soldiers who volunteered for it would quietly fail within days. Beckwith wanted men who could think alone, in the dark, under a collapsing plan, without anyone above them issuing orders. The army resisted him for years. It took a hostage crisis in Tehran in 1979 and the burning wreckage of a failed rescue attempt in the desert outside that city to finally convince Washington that Beckwith had been right all along. Out of that failure, and out of the furious reforms that followed it, the unit that would eventually become known simply as Delta Force was allowed to grow into what its founder had always intended, not an army within an army, but something closer to a scalpel kept permanently in a locked drawer, brought out only when a war needed precision instead of mass. For 20 years that scalpel stayed mostly in the drawer, used in small classified operations the public rarely heard about. Then came a Tuesday morning in September of 2001, and the drawer opened for good. Before we go further into what happened when it did, it is worth pausing here. If the idea of a war fought almost entirely in silence, told through the words of the people who feared it most, is the kind of story that pulls you in, that is exactly what this channel, Blue Force, exists to tell. Consider following along, because the missions ahead only get more astonishing from here. 6 weeks after the towers fell, on the night of October the 19th, 2001, 2 task forces lifted off from a base outside Pakistan into the darkness over southern Afghanistan, flying so low that pilots later described skimming close enough to the desert floor to feel the heat still rising off the sand from the day before. Their targets were 2 of the most symbolically important locations the Taliban controlled. Army Rangers would parachute directly onto an airfield near Kandahar in a combat jump unlike anything the American military had attempted since Panama, more than a decade earlier, seizing the runway to prove that American forces could go anywhere in Afghanistan they chose. A few hundred kilometers away, a smaller and far more secretive force would fly directly into the compound of Mullah Mohammed Omar himself, the reclusive one-eyed cleric who led the Taliban and had sheltered the men responsible for September the 11th. Picture the compound from the inside, in the seconds before it happened. Thick mud walls built to survive decades of tribal warfare. Guard posts positioned with real military logic, angled to cover the obvious approaches. A generator humming somewhere behind the main house, the only mechanical sound for kilometers in every direction. And then, without warning that any sentry could process in time, the night itself seemed to detonate. Helicopters that had approached along terrain too broken for radar to track suddenly filled the sky above the walls. Stun grenades turned the courtyard white. Within minutes, operators had swept every structure inside the compound, killing defenders who never fully understood what they were fighting. and were gone again before a serious counterattack could be organized from the surrounding town. It was, by the account of the men who planned it, a smaller operation than intended, one that grew complicated in ways the public would only piece together years later. But its message required no elaboration. 6 weeks after the deadliest attack in American history, the leader of the Taliban had learned that his own front door, guarded by men who had known him for years, offered him no safety at all. A defector who later spoke with journalists about that autumn described the effect on ordinary fighters in blunt terms, that a man could no longer trust the walls around him, because the Americans, he said, seemed to already be standing inside them before anyone had seen them arrive. To understand how a unit could produce that kind of effect on men who were themselves hardened veterans of war against the Soviet Union, it helps to follow a single node in the network, rather than the network as a whole. A Delta Force officer, who would later write under the pen name Dalton Fury, protecting an identity that remains classified to this day, commanded roughly 90 special operations personnel during one of the most consequential and least understood chapters of the entire Afghan campaign. He was, by his own later account, an unremarkable-seeming man in his late 30s, the kind of person you would not look at twice in an airport terminal. That was, in its own way, the entire point of the unit he served. Its operators were selected as much for the ability to disappear into a crowd as for marksmanship or physical strength. In December of 2001, this officer and roughly 40 operators from his unit, joined by a smaller number of Green Berets, a handful of Central Intelligence Agency officers, Air Force combat controllers calling in airstrikes with pinpoint accuracy, and a contingent of British commandos, were given one of the most consequential assignments of the entire war: find Osama bin Laden, believed to be hiding somewhere inside the cave complexes of Tora Bora, high in the mountains along the Pakistani border, and either capture or kill him before he could slip across. The operators grew their beards out for weeks beforehand, and wore local clothing, understanding that in these mountains, looking foreign for even a few seconds could get an entire team killed. They drove battered pickup trucks instead of armored vehicles. They lived alongside Afghan militia fighters, whose loyalty was never entirely certain, and whose insistence on breaking their Ramadan fast each evening meant the ground painfully won during the day was often surrendered again by nightfall. For nearly 2 weeks, American aircraft pounded the mountainside above them while the small team on the ground tracked bin Laden through intercepted radio transmissions, at one point recovering a functioning radio from a dead fighter that opened an entire channel into Al-Qaeda's communications. On the 10th of December, an intercepted message crackled through that channel, bin Laden himself, telling his men he was trying to break through the encirclement. By the 16th of December, his voice on the radio had grown audibly desperate, rallying fighters who were beginning to abandon the fight around him. He was, by every account later reconstructed from those intercepts, close enough that a different set of decisions made in Washington might have ended the manhunt then and there. Instead, without enough conventional forces committed to seal the mountain passes into Pakistan, bin Laden slipped across the border in the final days of December, escaping a trap that had for one impossible week held him closer to capture than at any other point in the following decade. It would be dishonest to call Tora Bora a clean victory. The men who were there have spent years since publicly wrestling with what went wrong, writing books and testifying before Congress about a mission that came agonizingly close and still fell short. But dishonest too would be ignoring what even that partial failure revealed about the pressure this small community of operators could apply. A network that had ruled an entire nation 8 weeks earlier was, by the end of that December, reduced to a single terrified man on a radio, begging his own fighters not to abandon him, hunted through mountains he had once considered his most secure refuge on Earth. 3 months later, in the spring of 2002, the war would produce its costliest single engagement for American special operations, and one that revealed something the earlier raids had not, that these men could suffer catastrophic loss, and still, somehow, deepen rather than diminish the fear they inspired. Operation Anaconda was designed as a hammer and anvil assault, meant to crush the last significant concentration of Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters entrenched in the Shahi Valley of Paktia province. As part of that operation, a small reconnaissance team was ordered to establish an observation post atop a mountain named Tukur Gar, more than 3,000 meters above sea level, a position that would let American forces watch the valley below in real time. What the planners did not know was that the enemy had already recognized the tactical value of that same peak, and had spent days digging fighting positions into its frozen ground, invisible from the air under a dusting of fresh snow. Just after 2 in the morning on the 3rd of March, a helicopter carrying a team of Navy SEALs flared to land directly on the summit. In the instant before touchdown, a rocket-propelled grenade tore through the aircraft, severing hydraulic lines and slicking the deck with oil. As the pilot fought to pull the crippled helicopter off the mountain, a young SEAL named Neil Roberts, his boots losing purchase on the fluid-soaked ramp, slipped and fell backward out of the open door, dropping into the snow below as the aircraft lurched away into the darkness. His teammates watching in horror from inside a helicopter they could not turn around in time, had no way to go back for him. Neil Roberts was alone on an enemy-held mountaintop, in sub-zero temperatures, surrounded by fighters who had watched the entire helicopter fail and knew exactly where he had landed. What followed became known as the Battle of Roberts Ridge. A 17-hour fight fought at an altitude so extreme that even the aircraft struggled to generate lift, waged by a rotating cast of SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Tactics Airmen, and Delta Force personnel coordinating the response from the valley below. A second helicopter returned to the same landing zone to recover Roberts and was immediately raked by machine gun fire from the same hidden trench line, forcing an emergency retreat. A third attempt inserted a small team that fought its way toward Roberts's last known position through waist-deep snow, under direct fire from bunkers dug so close that combatants on both sides could hear each other shouting. An Air Force pararescueman named Jason Cunningham, who had already helped save the lives of several wounded teammates that morning, was killed while continuing to treat casualties under fire rather than seek cover himself. By the time the mountain was finally secured, 7 Americans had been killed and roughly a dozen more wounded, making it, in terms of raw cost, one of the harshest single-day special operations forces endured in the entire war. And yet listen to how the men who survived that mountain, and the officers who watched the fight unfold from below described what they saw. Not chaos, not panic. A Delta Force officer coordinating the battle from the valley later recounted watching, through the feed of an overhead aircraft, wounded Americans continuing to fight in direct airstrikes onto positions meters from their own bodies, refusing evacuation until every teammate still alive had been accounted for. That discipline, maintained through catastrophic loss, at an altitude where simply breathing took visible effort, at temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes, is not the kind of thing an enemy forgets. Fighters who survived that same engagement and were later captured elsewhere in Paktia province described, according to interrogation summaries collected in the months that followed, an almost disbelieving respect for what they had witnessed. Soldiers who kept fighting effectively, while grievously wounded, who called artillery onto their own position rather than let the mountain fall, who seemed to treat their own deaths as a tactical variable to be managed rather than a reason to break. It is worth sitting with the contrast for a moment, because it cuts against everything the popular imagination assumes about this conflict. For 8 years, the Soviet Union had fought these same mountains and these same tribal networks with overwhelming firepower, and had eventually been fought to exhaustion and withdrawal by fighters who understood that a large conventional army moving in large conventional formations could be worn down through patience alone. Where the Soviet occupation over time became defined, in the memory of the people who lived through it, by helicopters that could be heard for kilometers, and convoys that announced themselves along fixed roads. The American Special Operations campaign that followed built its entire reputation on the opposite principle: unpredictability, near total silence in the final approach, and a willingness to insert teams of a handful of men directly onto a target that a conventional force would have needed a battalion to secure. The insurgency had in a sense prepared itself brilliantly to fight the last war. It had almost no answer for this one. That contrast became a matter of open record nearly a decade later, during the surge of American forces under General David Petraeus, between 2010 and 2011, when a campaign of nighttime raids against mid-level Taliban commanders became, by the assessment of a senior Defense Department official quoted at the time, the single most effective tactic being used in the entire war. Local officials across the frontline provinces reported that entire insurgent networks had been forced to fracture into smaller, more cautious cells simply to survive the pace of the raids. A former deputy governor of Helmand province, reflecting on 3 years overseeing the aftermath of that campaign in his own territory, put it in 6 blunt words that traveled through military reporting at the time: that the raids, in his words, had broken the back of the Taliban in significant parts of the province. A provincial legislator from Paktia, describing the psychological toll on ordinary villagers, rather than the fighters themselves, offered an observation that captured something even the raid's harshest critics could not dispute: that people in those villages had grown more afraid of the unpredictable arrival of American forces at night than of the insurgents who claimed to protect them. That fear was not irrational, and it was not without real human cost, a fact this story would be incomplete without acknowledging honestly. The very secrecy that made these raids so devastating to the insurgency also made them almost impossible for ordinary Afghan families to prepare for or contest when mistakes were made. And mistakes were made. Homes struck on faulty intelligence, unarmed relatives killed in the confusion of a door breached in total darkness. President Hamid Karzai himself became one of the campaign's most vocal critics, telling reporters directly that soldiers of any nation breaking into Afghan homes at night was not a legitimate way to conduct a war, regardless of the intelligence behind it, and demanding an end to the practice even as his own generals quietly acknowledged how effective it had become. This is not a story that can honestly be told as a simple triumph. It is a story about a tactic so effective that it reshaped an insurgency, and costly enough in trust and civilian harm, that the man leading the country it was fought in publicly condemned it. Both of those things were true, often in the very same week. But it is precisely in that discomfort, that inability of an occupied population to ever fully predict where or when these teams would appear, that the language shift becomes impossible to ignore. For most of the war, American infantry units serving in rural districts had used a particular word for the insurgents they hunted and rarely saw: ghosts, an enemy that fired from tree lines and vanished before a patrol could close the distance, that seemed to melt into a village population the instant a firefight ended. It is a word that appears again and again in the accounts soldiers gave journalists throughout the war, describing the maddening experience of fighting an enemy who was, by design, almost never actually visible. What interrogation summaries and captured letters from the surge years increasingly suggest, though, is that somewhere across those same years, the label had begun to travel in the opposite direction as well. Fighters described, in translated accounts collected by researchers studying the psychological effects of the raids, an enemy of their own that struck without any warning sound, that seemed to know the layout of a compound before ever setting foot inside it, that could be standing in a room its target had checked minutes earlier and somehow missed. One widely repeated phrase attributed to fighters operating in Kandahar and Helmand during those years distilled the sentiment into something almost superstitious, that these were not soldiers you fought, but soldiers who had already decided the fight was over before you knew it had begun. That is, in the end, where a title like the one describing these men as something other than human actually comes from. And it is worth being precise about what it does and does not mean. It is not a literal claim, made by any serious source, that American operators possessed some inhuman power. It is a translation problem. The same collision that has produced ghost stories and demon legends in every war fought across every century, whenever soldiers who take enormous deliberate risks to remain unseen collide with an enemy that has no framework for that kind of discipline. What the men of Delta Force and the broader special operations community actually possessed was something far less mystical and, in a way, far more impressive. Years of selection designed to eliminate anyone who could not function calmly inside total uncertainty, technology that let them own the night in a way no army in history ever fully had before them, and a doctrine built entirely around depriving an enemy of the one thing every fighter, however brave, depends on to function: the ability to predict where the next threat is coming from. The war that produced all of this ended, for the United States, in the chaos of an airport in August of 2021, 20 years almost to the month after it began. The Taliban that had once feared to sleep in their own homes returned to govern the same country from which they had fled. It would be easy, looking only at that final image, to conclude that none of what came before it mattered, that 2 decades of raids and mountain battles and men who disappeared into rooms without doors amounted in the end to nothing. That conclusion misunderstands what this kind of warfare was ever built to accomplish. It was never designed to hold ground, or to win the kind of decisive, flag-planting victory that populates history textbooks and feature films. It was designed to apply pressure so precise and so relentless that an enemy's entire command structure spent 2 decades looking over its shoulder instead of consolidating power. And in that narrower, harder-to-see mission, the record left behind, not by American press releases, but by the enemy's own captured words, speaks for itself. History remembers the beaches and the tank columns because they photograph well, because their outcomes are simple to narrate in an hour of screen time. It has far less patience for a war fought by small teams in total darkness, where the clearest evidence of what actually happened survives not in triumphant footage but in the frightened testimony of the men who lost. Somewhere in an interrogation transcript, in a captured letter never meant to reach American hands, in the quiet, disbelieving words of a fighter trying to explain to his commanders how an entire compound had fallen silently around him, is the actual measure of what this unit built. Not a myth, and not a movie, just the uncomfortable, well-documented truth that the most feared soldiers in a 20-year war were very often the ones the enemy never saw coming, and rarely saw at all.